December 1944, Camp Tonkawa, Oklahoma. A winter wind moved dust across the narrow paths between the wooden barracks. Inside one of them, beneath a weak hanging bulb, several German prisoners sat around a small iron stove wrapped in army blankets stamped with faded American markings. The war felt very far away there. No artillery, no collapsing buildings, only silence. And waiting point one of the prisoners held a copy of Life magazine that had already passed through dozens of hands across the camp. The edges were torn soft from use. He turned the pages slowly, more from boredom than curiosity. Then he stopped. Across 2 full pages stood an American woman inside an aircraft factory. Her sleeves were rolled above her elbows, rivet gun in hand, safety goggles resting on her forehead. Behind her stretched the unfinished body of a B-24 bomber. She was smiling, not posed formally, not frightened, not exhausted beyond recognition. She looked confident, almost proud to be there. Around him, the barracks grew quieter. Months earlier, German propaganda had described American women as weak products of luxury. Japanese military doctrine had portrayed them as fragile civilians protected by comfort and distance from war. Yet here, printed in ink impossible to deny, was a different reality entirely. And for many Axis prisoners, that realization did not arrive through interrogation rooms or battlefield defeat. It arrived through photographs. Long before Axis prisoners ever saw American magazines inside prison camps, both Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan had already spent years constructing carefully controlled visions of womanhood, citizenship, and national strength. Those visions shaped how millions of soldiers understood the world long before they encountered the enemy face-to-dash face, that in Germany. The Nazi state promoted an ideal rooted in obedience, racial purity, and domestic duty. The phrase Kinder, Kusch, Kirche, children, kitchen, church, was never the entirety of Nazi gender policy, but it reflected the cultural direction the regime encouraged. Women were praised as mothers of the nation. Large families were rewarded. Public imagery celebrated childbirth, sacrifice, and loyalty to the state. Adolf Hitler himself often described women as guardians of the German future, rather than participants in political or industrial life. This vision was not absolute. As the war deepened and labor shortages worsened, German women entered factories, offices, and support services in growing numbers. But Nazi propaganda still avoided presenting female independence as a virtue. The regime feared that social liberalism represented weakness. American society, especially its women, became a frequent target of ridicule in newspapers, films, and political speeches. German soldiers were repeatedly told that the United States lacked discipline. American civilians were portrayed as soft consumers corrupted by wealth and entertainment. Women in particular were described as materialistic, overly sexualized, and disconnected from sacrifice. Nazi media contrasted this image with what it called the moral seriousness of German society. The propaganda served a strategic purpose. If soldiers believed their enemy lacked endurance, then victory appeared inevitable. In Imperial Japan, the ideological structure surrounding women developed differently, but reached similar conclusions. Japanese society before and during the war remained heavily influenced by the principle of Ryosai Kenbo, good wife, wise mother. Women were expected to support family stability, preserve social order, and contribute quietly to the nation through duty and discipline. Military culture reinforced these expectations even more aggressively. Imperial Japanese training emphasized hierarchy, endurance, and collective obedience. Soldiers were taught that spiritual purity mattered more than comfort or material wealth. American culture, by contrast, was portrayed as shallow and individualistic. Japanese propaganda often described the United States as decadent. Newspapers, military pamphlets, and state-approved films presented American women as symbols of moral decline, fashionable, dependent, emotionally weak, and incapable of enduring hardship. The image supported a larger ideological claim that Japan possessed spiritual strength, while America relied only on machines and industry. For many young Japanese recruits raised in rural villages during the 1930s, there were few opportunities to challenge these ideas. Foreign media was tightly restricted. International travel was rare. Wartime censorship intensified isolation even further. By By the early 1940s, most ordinary soldiers had never seen authentic American civilian life beyond carefully selected propaganda images. The same was true across much of Germany. Even before the war, Joseph Goebbels' Ministry of Propaganda controlled newspapers, radio broadcasts, films, publishing houses, and photography on a massive scale. Information passed through ideological filters before reaching the public. Defeats were minimized. Enemy successes were distorted. Social conditions inside Allied countries were presented through caricature rather than observation at a essay result. Countless Axis soldiers entered combat carrying simplified mental images of the enemy world. Then came captivity to be why in 1943, the United States was holding tens of thousands of Axis prisoners across an expanding network of POW camps. German prisoners arrived in large numbers after the North African Campaign, and later after the collapse of Axis forces in Europe. Japanese prisoners remained fewer in number because surrender carried enormous cultural shame within the imperial military system. But by the final years of the Pacific War, American forces had begun capturing increasing numbers alive. For many prisoners, arrival in the United States produced immediate confusion. The camps themselves did not match expectations. Under Geneva Convention regulations, prisoners generally received food, medical treatment, shelter, and access to recreation. Conditions varied between camps, and tension certainly existed, but many Axis prisoners encountered levels of stability they had not expected after years of total war. Outside the fences, another contradiction appeared. American towns continued functioning with astonishing industrial energy. Freight trains moved constantly. Highways carried military traffic in every direction. Factories operated day and night. And increasingly, women appeared everywhere within that system, not hidden from public life. Visible inside IT to AT first, many prisoners dismissed what they saw as staged wartime theater. But slowly, magazines and newspapers began placing undeniable visual evidence directly into their hands. And once those pages began circulating to the barracks, the ideological certainty built over years of propaganda started to weaken in ways neither Berlin nor Tokyo had anticipated. By the middle years of the war, the United States held more than 370,000 German prisoners of war across hundreds of camps spread from Texas and Arizona to Wisconsin and New York. The system expanded rapidly after the Axis defeat in North Africa in 1943, when thousands of captured soldiers were transported across the Atlantic aboard crowded prison ships and transferred deep into the American interior. Many expected brutality. Instead, they found routine. The camps were surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers. But daily life often followed strict schedules built around work assignments, meals, recreation, and education. Prisoners played football, formed orchestras, painted signs, repaired roads, harvested crops, and attended language classes. Under the Geneva Convention, the United States allowed access to reading materials, religious services, and monitored communication. Inside that environment, printed media became one of the most influential forces in camp life. American authorities understood that newspapers and magazines served more than entertainment purposes. They offered controlled glimpse into the society the prisoners had spent years fighting against. In some camps, officials distributed selected publications directly. In others, prisoners obtained magazines through guards, local civilians, Red Cross channels, or work details outside camp fences. Titles like Life, Look, Collier's, and the Saturday Evening Post appeared repeatedly. For German prisoners especially, Life magazine became impossible to ignore. Its photography carried enormous persuasive power. Unlike ideological posters or military leaflets, the magazine relied heavily on realism. Large-format photographs documented factories, battlefronts, hospitals, classrooms, farms, and city streets with striking clarity. And within those images, American women appeared constantly. Not only actresses or fashion models, workers, mechanics, nurses, drivers, telephone operators, laboratory technicians, aircraft assemblers. Women stood beside giant bomber engines with grease on their hands. Others operated cranes inside shipyards, producing Liberty ships at astonishing speed. Female military personnel directed traffic, repaired equipment, ferried aircraft between bases, and processed intelligence reports beneath maps covered in pins and colored lines. For prisoners raised under rigid ideological systems, the effect was deeply unsettling because the images did not appear staged in the traditional propaganda sense. The women often looked ordinary, tired sometimes, focused, busy, yet undeniably active participants in the war effort. The scale mattered too to why in 1944, nearly every major sector of American wartime production depended heavily on female labor. More than 6 million additional women had entered the workforce since the beginning of the war. Aircraft factories alone employed hundreds of thousands. The famous cultural symbol later known as Rosie the Riveter represented far more than a poster campaign. It reflected a visible transformation taking place across the American economy. Axis prisoners gradually realized they were not observing isolated exceptions. They were seeing an entire industrial society reorganizing itself for war. Japanese prisoners encountered these contradictions differently. Their numbers remained far smaller, and their experiences often passed through interrogation centers in the Pacific before transfer to rear facilities. Many have been taught that surrender itself erased personal honor. Some initially refused to believe anything presented by American personnel. But visual media still penetrated where arguments often failed. Interrogation officers and psychological warfare specialists learned that photographs could bypass ideological resistance more effectively than direct confrontation. Captured Japanese soldiers who distrusted spoken explanations sometimes reacted differently when handed magazines showing American civilians calmly adapting to wartime hardship. One recurring point of shock involved visibility. American women did not appear hidden behind the war. They appeared integrated into it. Japanese prisoners saw images of women studying engineering diagrams, serving in military uniforms, repairing aircraft wings, donating blood, driving ambulances, and operating communications equipment near active combat zones. In several cases recorded by U.S. intelligence personnel, prisoners reportedly questioned whether such photographs were fabricated because the scenes contradicted everything wartime propaganda had taught them about American society. Yet the magazines kept returning with new editions. Month after month, the same patterns appeared. Another woman in a factory, another female pilot climbing from a cockpit, another nurse standing beside wounded Marines on Pacific Islands, another student attending university classes while wearing industrial work clothing between shifts. The consistency created credibility. For some prisoners, the realization remained purely practical. They began understanding the industrial depth behind American military power. A nation where women participated broadly in production could sustain enormous logistical output. Bombers destroyed over Europe could be replaced. Ships sunk in the Pacific could be rebuilt. Damaged armies could receive fresh supplies continuously. But for others, the impact reached deeper than economics. The magazines exposed society functioning according to assumptions completely different from the world they had known before the war. Authority, gender roles, labor, education, even personal behavior appeared more flexible than Axis propaganda had ever admitted. Inside quiet barracks lit by weak bulbs and winter stoves, prisoners who had crossed oceans to fight the United States slowly began studying photographs not as enemy propaganda, but as evidence. And that evidence would soon begin changing how many of them understood the war itself. The photographs that lingered longest inside many POW barracks were often the simplest ones, not battlefield images, not destroyed cities, not even military victories. Factory floors, rows of women standing beneath steel beams and hanging lamps inside aircraft plants stretching farther than the eye could follow. Women balancing atop unfinished bomber fuselages. Women welding ship hulls beside showers of sparks. Women tightening bolts into tank engines while assembly lines moved endlessly behind them. To American civilians in 1944. Such scenes had become familiar. Wartime necessity had transformed the labor force at extraordinary speed. Millions of men had entered military service, and industry required replacement workers immediately. Government campaigns encouraged women to enter factories, transportation systems, offices, laboratories, and heavy manufacturing. But for many Axis prisoners, the scale of female industrial labor seemed almost impossible to process. German prisoners had certainly seen women working before the war. Rural labor and wartime shortages made that unavoidable. Yet Nazi ideology continued portraying heavy industry and national power as fundamentally masculine domains. Public imagery emphasized male soldiers, male engineers, male political authority. Inside American magazines, the opposite impression emerged. Women did not appear temporary or symbolic. They appeared essential. One former German POW later recalled his surprise at photographs showing female workers assembling aircraft engines with visible technical competence. He had expected stage propaganda featuring smiling civilians posing beside machinery. Instead, the images showed concentration, exhaustion, precision, and industrial discipline. The machinery itself mattered too. The United States did not merely employ women in support roles. It integrated them directly into mass production systems operating on unprecedented scales. Ford's Willow Run plant in Michigan produced B-24 bombers at astonishing rates. Shipyards in California launched Liberty ships faster than many foreign observers believed possible. Across thousands of photographs, women stood inside those systems as active participants. For prisoners already confronting Allied military superiority, the realization carried strategic implications that America's workforce was larger than expected because it had mobilized far beyond traditional assumptions. And behind every new bomber crossing the Atlantic or Pacific, there was now another image impossible to forget. Women helping build it. If factory photographs created surprise, images of women in military uniforms often created silence. Axis propaganda had spent years portraying the American military as technologically advanced but socially weak. Strength, discipline, and sacrifice were presented as uniquely masculine virtues within both Nazi and Imperial Japanese military culture. Women near military structures were usually depicted as nurses, entertainers, or symbolic supporters rather than operational personnel. American wartime imagery contradicted that immediately. Magazines arriving in POW camps showed women wearing service uniforms across nearly every branch of the U.S. Armed Forces. Members of the Women's Army Corps processed logistics paperwork beneath giant operational maps. Waves personnel operated communication systems for the Navy. Marine Corps Women's Reserve members handled administrative and technical duties. Army nurses stood only miles behind active front lines. Then there were the drivers and pilots. Photographs of women behind the wheel of military jeeps became especially memorable among some prisoners because the jeep itself symbolized American mobility and mechanized warfare. Axis soldiers had encountered those vehicles across Europe, North Africa, and the Pacific. Seeing women confidently operating them challenged deeply rooted assumptions about military hierarchy. The Women Air Force Service pilots, the WASPs, produced even stronger reactions among those who learned them, though not combat pilots. These women ferried aircraft between bases, tested repaired planes, and transported military cargo throughout the United States. TO prisoners raised within rigid military cultures. The concept itself felt extraordinary that a woman climbing into the cockpit of military aircraft represented more than a personnel assignment. It suggested a society willing to distribute responsibility differently than the regimes they had served. Japanese prisoners often reacted with visible disbelief to such imagery. Interrogation records from the Pacific occasionally noted skepticism toward photographs showing women performing military-related technical duties. Some prisoners initially assumed the scenes were posed solely for propaganda purposes. But again, repetition created credibility. Different magazines, different locations, different women. The same pattern continued appearing to be why late war. Over 350,000 American women were serving in uniform across multiple branches and support organizations. Their roles varied widely, but their visibility reshaped how many Axis prisoners perceived American society itself. The women in those photographs did not appear frightened by responsibility. They appeared accustomed to it. And for prisoners taught that social order depended on strict separation between male authority and female domestic life, that confidence proved more destabilizing than many American officials fully understood. Some reactions had little to do with military production or logistics. They were emotional. Inside countless photographs, Axis prisoners encountered something more difficult to define, a visible sense of personal freedom. American women in wartime magazines laughed openly beside co-workers. They attended dances near military bases. They studied at universities while participating in defense industries. They walked city streets unescorted. They smoked cigarettes in factory break areas. They argued politics in newspaper interviews. Some wore work trousers and heavy boots stained with oil and dust. For many Americans, such images reflected ordinary civilian life under wartime conditions. For many prisoners, they represent an entirely unfamiliar social atmosphere. German and Japanese societies both maintained strong expectations regarding public behavior, hierarchy, and gender presentation during the 1930s and wartime years. Emotional restraint, obedience, and conformity carried enormous cultural weight. Public individuality often remained secondary to national duty, yet the women appearing in American publications seemed visibly individual, not identical, not carefully uniform, different hairstyles, different expressions, different ambitions. This detail mattered psychologically because it challenged another core assumption promoted by Axis propaganda, that democracy produced weakness through disorder. The magazines instead suggested society functioning with enormous energy despite, or perhaps because of, its social openness. Several former prisoners later described being surprised not merely by what American women were doing, but by how naturally they appear to be doing it, no sense of state choreography, no rigid ceremonial atmosphere. The photographs conveyed movement, confidence, spontaneity, and slowly, some prisoners began recognizing a disturbing possibility. The United States was not powerful despite these freedoms. It might actually be powerful because of them. The United States did not invent wartime propaganda. Every major power in the Second World War relied heavily on controlled information, patriotic imagery, and emotional messaging. But American media operated differently from the tightly centralized propaganda systems of Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. That difference became visible inside the magazines themselves. Publications like Life and Look rarely presented the war through purely ideological language. Instead, they relied on photography, human stories, and visual realism. Readers saw factory workers eating lunch beside unfinished aircraft, nurses sleeping briefly between shifts, women waiting for telegrams from overseas, families planting victory gardens beneath apartment windows. The images carried emotional credibility because they included imperfection. Faces looked tired. Clothing appeared wrinkled. Workshops seemed noisy and crowded. Even stage government-approved photography often preserved enough realism to feel authentic. Inside POW camps, the style had unexpected consequences. Prisoners accustomed to rigid propaganda layouts encountered a media culture that appeared less scripted. Articles discussed shortages, casualties, labor disputes, and exhaustion alongside patriotic themes. American society did not present itself as flawless. Instead, it presented itself as active, adaptive, and openly engaged in struggle. That openness increased the persuasive power of the photographs. Psychological warfare officers eventually recognized the effect. Some interrogation specialists discovered that prisoners often responded more honestly after exposure to ordinary American civilian life than after direct political arguments. A prisoner might reject lectures about democracy while still quietly studying a magazine photograph for several minutes. Because photographs fell harder to dismiss. One image repeatedly circulated through several German POW camps during the later war years. Women standing atop partially completed bomber wings inside giant factories lit by rows of industrial lamps. The sheer scale visible in the background mattered as much as the workers themselves. Endless machinery, endless production lines, endless manpower. The message required no caption. America was not only fighting the war on battlefields, its entire society was participating. Japanese prisoners experienced similar reactions during Pacific interrogations. Some American intelligence reports noted that visual materials showing normal civilian life proved particularly effective in reducing ideological rigidity among prisoners raised under strict wartime censorship. Images of women working calmly beside male co-workers contradicted years of propaganda portraying the United States as morally weak and socially unstable. The magazines were never neutral, but they often felt believable enough to weaken certainty. And in war, certainty can collapse long before armies do. Although German and Japanese prisoners often encountered the same magazines, their reactions sometimes differed sharply because the ideological systems shaping them had developed in different ways. German POWs frequently responded analytically. Many came from industrial or urban backgrounds. Some possessed technical education. Others had worked in engineering, transportation, or manufacturing before military service. When they studied American photographs, they often focused first on production capacity and organization. They counted assembly lines. They examined machine layouts. They estimated labor scaled a German prisoner, looking at women, assembling bomber components, might quietly calculate how many aircraft such a factory could produce each month. Some eventually concluded that Germany's defeat had become unavoidable once the United States fully mobilized its industrial economy. The role of women inside that economy became impossible to ignore. Japanese reactions were often more emotional and psychologically disorienting. Imperial Japanese military culture had emphasized not only obedience, but also spiritual hierarchy and sacrifice. Many soldiers entered the war believing American civilians lacked endurance and collective discipline. Propaganda repeatedly portrayed Western society as selfish, materialistic, and morally fragmented. Yet the magazine showed women enduring difficult labor conditions voluntarily and publicly. That contradiction cut deeply. Interrogation records in the Pacific occasionally describe prisoners falling silent while examining photographs of female workers or nurses. Some questioned whether the women had been forced into those roles. Others appeared genuinely confused by the relaxed body language and visible confidence displayed in the images. The emotional impact sometimes extended beyond military understanding. For prisoners raised in highly controlled social environments, the magazines revealed a civilian culture operating with surprising openness. Women appeared educated, mobile, politically aware, and socially visible in ways many Japanese soldiers had never personally encountered before the war. Not every prisoner changed his views dramatically. Many remained loyal to Axis ideology even after surrender. Others dismissed American media entirely. But enough reactions were recorded to reveal a consistent pattern. The enemy civilization looked nothing like the one they had been taught to expect. And once prisoners recognized that fact in one area of life, doubts often spread into others. Questions about women became questions about industry. Questions about industry became questions about military power. Questions about military power eventually became questions about the war itself. That by late 1944, many Axis prisoners had reached a grim understanding. The United States possessed more than superior weapons that it possessed social flexibility. That realization emerged gradually through hundreds of small observations. Women replacing men in factories. Women driving military transport vehicles. Women studying medicine, engineering, communications, and logistics. Entire industries reorganizing without collapsing. For prisoners from societies built around rigid hierarchies, the speed of American adaptation seemed extraordinary. The numbers alone were staggering. American factories produced nearly 300,000 military aircraft during the war. Shipyards launched thousands of vessels. Tank production surged continuously despite battlefield losses across multiple continents. Beneath nearly every statistic stood an enormous civilian labor force, increasingly dependent on women. The magazines made that connection visible. Photographs rarely isolated military hardware from the workers producing it. Bombers appeared beside assembly crews. Naval guns beside welders. Medical advances beside female laboratory technicians. Industrial output appeared connected directly to civilian participation. Some German prisoners eventually admitted that the Axis powers had underestimated American society itself. They had viewed the United States primarily as a wealthy industrial nation protected by geography and machinery. The magazines revealed something broader. American power came from mobilization across nearly every layer of society, and women stood near the center of that transformation. For Japanese prisoners, the realization often carried additional emotional weight because imperial propaganda had emphasized spiritual superiority over material production. Yet the war's outcome increasingly suggested that industrial organization, education, logistics, and social participation could determine victory just as decisively as battlefield courage. Inside quiet prison camps and interrogation compounds, those conclusions emerged slowly to N.O.'s single photograph caused a transformation. N.O.'s single article shattered years of ideology. Instead, the effect accumulated page by page: a woman building bombers, a nurse treating wounded Marines, and a pilot climbing into a cockpit, a college student studying engineering diagrams beside factory machinery. Together, the images formed a portrait of society far more resilient and far more modern than many Axis prisoners had ever imagined possible. And eventually, those realizations would collide with the final collapse of the war itself. Spring 1945, and across Europe and the Pacific, the war was entering its final violent phase. German cities burned beneath continuous bombing campaigns. Soviet armies pushed toward Berlin street by street. In the Pacific, American forces moved steadily closer to the Japanese home islands through battles that left entire landscapes shattered. Inside POW camps thousands of miles away, the atmosphere changed with every new headline. Prisoners gathered around newspapers searching for fragments of information about collapsing fronts and advancing armies. Rumors moved faster than official announcements. Some men still believed Germany might negotiate peace with the Western allies. Others hoped Japan would inflict enough casualties to force a settlement. But beneath those conversations, another realization had already begun taking hold. The United States was not slowing down. Its factories continued expanding. Its air fleets multiplied. Its supply convoys crossed oceans continuously despite submarine attacks and battlefield losses. And inside the magazines circulating through the camps, American women remained visible everywhere within that machine of war. At Camp Concordia in Kansas and Camp Hearn in Texas. German prisoners working agricultural labor details occasionally encounter American civilian life directly. They saw women driving trucks between grain depots, women operating farm equipment while husbands or brothers served overseas, women handling bookkeeping inside local supply offices. The scenes rarely looked dramatic, but their normality carried enormous psychological weight. The magazines had not been exaggerating. Outside the fences, the society actually functioned that way. Several former prisoners later described moments of quiet disbelief during work assignments in American towns. Storefronts remained busy. Schools operated normally. Railroad yards functioned day and night. Women moved confidently through public spaces without the visible social restrictions common inside much of wartime Europe or Japan. The contrast sharpened every time new issues of life or look arrived in camp reading rooms. One widely circulated 1945 photo essay showed women ferrying military aircraft between bases inside the United States. The article explained how female pilots transported bombers, trainers, and fighters so combat-ready male pilots could remain near operational fronts. For many prisoners, the photographs carried strategic implications far beyond gender roles. America possessed enough trained personnel, enough fuel, enough aircraft, and enough institutional flexibility to assign women to aviation logistics while simultaneously deploying millions of men overseas. The scale felt overwhelming. Japanese prisoners experienced similar turning points through interrogation centers in the Pacific and Hawaii. By 1945, American intelligence operations had become increasingly sophisticated in studying how ideological conditioning influenced prisoner behavior. Officers learned that arguments about democracy or freedom often produce resistance. But ordinary images from American life sometimes bypass that resistance completely. One interrogation report described a captured Japanese naval serviceman studying photographs of American nurses working near frontline hospitals. He reportedly questioned why women would willingly place themselves so close to danger if American society was truly soft and comfort-obsessed, as propaganda had claimed. An interrogator needed to answer immediately. The photograph already had. Elsewhere, captured Japanese soldiers examined images of women manufacturing artillery shells, repairing aircraft engines, and participating in blood donation campaigns. The emotional reactions varied: confusion, skepticism, embarrassment, silence. But the pattern remained consistent. The enemy society appeared disciplined in ways they had not expected. And increasingly, some prisoners began connecting that social discipline directly to military defeat in Germany. Allied bombing campaigns had devastated production systems by late war. Fuel shortages crippled transportation. Entire cities struggled beneath collapsing infrastructure. Yet American magazines continued displaying uninterrupted industrial output across vast distances untouched by invasion. Women remained central within those images, not symbols standing beside victory, participants helping create it. Then came April 1945, and news of President Franklin Roosevelt's death reached POW camps with surprising emotional complexity. Some prisoners expected national instability or panic inside the United States. Instead, newspapers showed orderly mourning ceremonies, peaceful political transition, and continued military operations without interruption. For prisoners raised under regimes centered around dominant singular leaders, the continuity itself seemed remarkable. And again, the magazines reflected that stability. Women still reported to factories. Nurses still boarded transport ships. Students still attended classrooms beside wartime labor assignments. Civilian life adapted and continued to be why at that point, many prisoners had stopped viewing the photographs merely as propaganda material. They had become evidence of something larger than a nation capable of absorbing shock without paralysis, a society broad enough to mobilize nearly everyone inside it. And as Axis military collapse accelerated during the final months of the war, those quiet observations inside prison camps began merging with an even more devastating realization. The United States had not won only because of military strength. IT had won because its entire society had entered the war together. By May 1945, the war in Europe was ending in fragments. German prisoners inside American camps first heard the rumors through whispers moving between barracks after evening roll calls. Hitler was dead. Berlin had fallen. Soviet troops stood over the ruins of the Reich Chancellery. Entire German armies were surrendering across Europe without coordination or command. Then the official confirmation arrived. Germany had capitulated unconditionally on May 8, 1945, inside many POW camps. The reaction was not dramatic. There were no speeches, no riots, no sudden emotional collapse. Most prisoners had already sensed the outcome approaching for months. Allied air superiority, collapsing supply lines, and relentless bombing had made the direction of the war impossible to deny. But surrender changed how prisoners interpreted everything they had been seeing. The magazines scattered across camp tables no longer represented temporary wartime propaganda from an enemy nation. They became glimpses into the post-war world that would replace the one they had lost. Some prisoners began rereading older issues carefully. Photographs they had once dismissed now appeared differently in the light of defeat. Women operated machine tools inside Detroit factories. Female radio operators managing military communications. Nurses unloading medical supplies from transport aircraft. The images no longer looked symbolic. They looked explanatory. Germany had fought a war using increasingly exhausted manpower and shrinking industrial capacity. The United States had fought with society able to expand participation continuously as the conflict intensified. Women had not simply supported American victory from the background. They had enlarged the nation's ability to wage war. For certain German prisoners, especially those with technical or industrial backgrounds, this realization became deeply personal. Some later admitted they had underestimated the relationship between social structure and military power. Nazi ideology had celebrated rigid hierarchy and centralized authority. Yet America's looser, more adaptive civilian system had generated overwhelming production and logistical endurance. The magazines had shown that process happening in real time that in the Pacific. The final turning point arrived later, and with even greater shock. Throughout the summer of 1945, Japanese prisoners followed scattered reports from Okinawa, strategic bombing campaigns, and naval defeats with growing uncertainty. American aircraft struck Japanese cities repeatedly. Supply systems deteriorated. Entire urban districts vanished beneath firebombing raids. Still, many believed Japan would continue fighting indefinitely. Then came Hiroshima. August 6, 1945. 3 days later, Nagasaki. For prisoners already confronting the collapse of wartime propaganda, the atomic bombings created a psychological rupture unlike anything earlier in the war. Rumors spread quickly through interrogation compounds and holding facilities. Entire cities destroyed by single bombs. Massive civilian casualties. Radiation sickness few fully understood. And behind the terrifying scale of American military capabilities stood the same industrial system prisoners had been observing for months through magazines and photographs. The bomb itself represented science, engineering, logistics, and production on levels beyond pre-war imagination. But the broader war effort surrounding it still depended upon the mobilization of millions across American society, including women working in factories, laboratories, communication centers, transportation systems, and military support services. Some Japanese prisoners reportedly reacted with stunned silence when Emperor Hirohito announced surrender on August 15. 4 years. Propaganda had described America as spiritually weak. Yet the war's conclusion suggested something entirely different. The United States had demonstrated extraordinary organizational strength, industrial flexibility, technological innovation, and social mobilization across nearly every layer of civilian life. And many prisoners had witnessed evidence of that transformation long before surrender arrived. Not through battlefield encounters, Through photographs that in the months following the war, Allied occupation authorities in Germany and Japan introduced educational programs, exposing civilians to documentary footage, and censored newspapers and foreign publications previously restricted under wartime regimes. Former prisoners returning home carried memories that sometimes conflicted sharply with pre-war assumptions. Some spoke quietly about what they'd seen inside American camps, the abundance, the scale of production, the visibility of women inside public life, the confidence displayed in ordinary civilian routines. Not every former prisoner changed ideologically. Many remained bitter. Others rejected American culture entirely. But countless memoirs, interviews, and intelligence records reveal that wartime exposure to authentic American civilian imagery left lasting impressions, especially the photographs. Years later, one former German POW reportedly described remembering a particular magazine image more clearly than certain battlefields from the war itself. A woman standing inside a bomber factory, smiling slightly while holding a rivet gun beside an unfinished aircraft winged. At the time, he had stared at the photograph in silence without fully understanding why it unsettled him. Only later did he realize what he'd been seeing. Not merely a worker, but evidence that the war had become larger than armies alone, and once entire societies entered the conflict together, the outcome had already begun shifting long before the final surrender documents were signed. When the war finally ended in 1945, millions of soldiers across Europe and Asia began the long movement back toward ruined cities, damaged economies, and uncertain political futures. Among them were former Axis prisoners who had spent months, and in some cases years, inside American camps surrounded by newspapers, magazines, radio broadcasts, and glimpses of civilian life unlike anything they had known before capture. For many, the return home felt disorienting. Germany lay physically shattered. Entire districts of Berlin, Hamburg, Cologne, and Dresden existed as landscapes of broken concrete and exposed steel. Rail systems barely functioned. Food shortages spread across urban centers. Millions searched for missing relatives while occupation authorities divided the country into military zones controlled by the Allies. Japan faced devastation of a different kind. Tokyo, Osaka, Yokohama, and dozens of other cities carried the scars of incendiary bombing campaigns that had consumed entire neighborhoods in firestorms. Industrial infrastructure struggled to operate. Transportation networks remained damaged. The psychological shock of surrender, especially after years of official promises about inevitable victory, lingered heavily across the population. Into these defeated societies returned prisoners carrying unexpected memories of America. Some remembered abundance. Others remembered industrial scale. Many remembered the strange normality of civilian life, continuing during wartime. But again and again, one recurring observation appeared in post-war interviews and memoirs. The visibility of women inside American society had challenged assumptions they once believed unquestionable. This mattered because post-war reconstruction required enormous social change in occupied Germany. Allied authorities launched broad democratization programs intended to dismantle Nazi ideology and rebuild civic institutions. Newspapers reopened under supervision. Foreign publications circulated more freely. Educational reforms emphasized political pluralism and international awareness. German civilians who had spent years under propaganda systems suddenly encountered and censored information from outside the former Reich. For returning POWs, the transition sometimes felt less shocking because fragments of that outside world had already reached them during captivity. The same pattern appeared in Japan under Allied occupation, led by General Douglas MacArthur. New constitutional reforms reshaped political institutions, education systems, labor laws, and civil rights structures. One of the most historically significant transformations involved women themselves. The post-war Japanese constitution granted women voting rights and expanded legal equality in ways unimaginable under pre-war military rule. Newspapers and magazines rapidly changed tone. Images of educated, politically active, professionally employed women became increasingly common in urban life. For some former prisoners, the cultural shift resembled scenes they had already witnessed years earlier inside American publications. The contrast between wartime propaganda and post-war reality became difficult to ignore at the same time. American society itself continued changing because of the wartime experiences that magazines had documented so heavily. Millions of women who entered factories, transportation networks, laboratories, and military support organizations during the war did not simply disappear from public life afterward. Many left industrial positions once servicemen returned home, yet the broader social transformation remained irreversible. Women had demonstrated technical skill in aviation plants, shipyard, hospitals, engineering offices, and military administration on a national scale. The war accelerated long-term changes in education, employment expectations, and public visibility. Even where traditional pressures attempted to restore older social patterns, the memory of wartime participation remained powerful. Former Axis prisoners observing America after the war often noticed that continuity immediately. The women they had first encountered in magazines during captivity had not represented temporary propaganda inventions. They reflected genuine structural changes inside American society, i.e. Germany. Some former POWs later described how wartime exposure to American civilian life complicated their post-war attitudes toward democracy and modernization. A number became more skeptical of rigid authoritarian systems after witnessing the flexibility and resilience of the United States firsthand. Others focused less on politics and more on practical conclusions. America had mobilized its entire population more effectively. That included women, Japanese veterans, and former prisoners, sometimes reached similar conclusions through different emotional paths. The imperial system had taught that national strength emerged from spiritual discipline, obedience, and sacrifice directed downward through rigid hierarchy. Yet the war's outcome suggested that industrial adaptability, scientific education, and broader civilian participation carried enormous strategic importance. The magazines had offered early evidence of that reality years before surrender forced acknowledgement. And as occupation reform spread to defeated nations during the late 1940s, those wartime photographs began feeling less like distant enemy propaganda and more like previews of a rapidly changing modern world. As the late 1940s turned into the 1950s, the physical ruins of war slowly gave way to reconstruction. Cities were rebuilt, railways reopened, factories restarted production. New governments emerged from the collapse of old regimes. Yet beneath the rebuilding of roads and industries, another transformation continued quietly inside millions of minds. The war had altered how entire societies understood the role of women. For former Axis prisoners, that realization often returned unexpectedly through ordinary moments. A newspaper photograph, a university classroom filled with female students, a woman working behind a government office desk, a nurse managing a modern hospital ward. The scenes no longer looked temporary or foreign. They increasingly resembled a future taking shape around them in West Germany. The economic recovery, later known as the Wirtschaftswunder, depended heavily on rebuilding labor systems destroyed by the war. Women participated broadly in reconstruction efforts during years when countless men remained dead, wounded, or missing. Rubble clearing alone became symbolic of post-war survival. Across devastated cities, women known as Trümmerfrauen, rubble women, carried bricks through streets where entire districts had collapsed into dust. The imagery differed from the glossy American magazines once passed through POW barracks, but the underlying reality felt familiar. Modern societies could not function by restricting half their population to the margins during national crisis in Japan. Industrial recovery accelerated rapidly during the American occupation, and the years that followed, educational opportunities expanded. Urban employment patterns shifted. Women entered offices, factories, healthcare systems, and universities in growing numbers as the country rebuilt itself into a major economic power. Traditional social expectations certainly survived. Change came unevenly and often faced resistance. But the war had permanently weakened older assumptions about what women could or could not do inside modern industrial nations. For some historians, this became one of the quieter but most important consequences of the Second World War. Not simply battlefield victory. Social transformation. The photographs that once startled prisoners inside camps now resembled early evidence of broader global change already underway. Historians studying POW memoirs and intelligence records have repeatedly noted how often visual media appeared in prisoner recollections. Many former captives remembered specific images decades later with surprising clarity. Not speeches, not official lectures, Images of a woman welding inside a shipyard, a female pilot beside a transport aircraft, a nurse standing calmly amid wounded soldiers, and a factory worker smiling beside a bomber fuselage stretching into the background. The emotional power of those photographs came partly from what they represented psychologically. Axis propaganda had depended on simplification. The enemy needed to appear morally weak, socially unstable, or spiritually inferior. But real civilian life proved more complicated than ideology allowed. Once prisoners recognized complexity in one area, certainty weakened elsewhere too. Some former German prisoners later admitted they had begun questioning propaganda only after comparing official claims to ordinary American life observed firsthand during captivity. Japanese prisoners sometimes described similar moments of quiet contradiction when reality no longer aligned with wartime indoctrination. None of this erased the brutality of the war itself. Millions remained dead across Europe and Asia. Entire populations carried trauma that would last generations. POW experiences varied widely, and many prisoners returned home bitter, traumatized, or politically unchanged. Yet history often shifts through small human observations as much as dramatic battles. Inside barracks lit by weak lamps, enemy soldiers once turned magazine pages expecting to confirm what they already believed about America. Instead, some encountered evidence that slowly dismantled years of certainty. Not through slogans, through ordinary images of civilian life. And perhaps that was a deeper significance of those wartime magazines. They revealed that modern warfare was no longer fought solely by armies standing at front lines. It depended on engineers, nurses, drivers, teachers, factory workers, researchers, and logistics systems stretching across entire continents. Women were not standing outside that transformation. They were helping drive IT to be by the end of the 20th century. Many of the social changes once viewed as shocking inside POW camps have become ordinary realities across much of the world. Women serve in governments, universities, industries, militaries, laboratories, and transportation systems globally. But during the winter nights of World War II, those futures still existed only in scattered photographs passed quietly from hand to hand across prison barracks far from home. And for some prisoners, those images remained unforgettable long after the war itself disappeared into history.